Good evening. We'll jump right into it today. We left off discussing the construction of the temple, and let me just get the sources on so that we can see it. If, by the way, you have trouble finding or seeing the sources, please just send me a message. We'll try to make it more visible. So I thought to answer a question that we got earlier today that is relevant to the Parshiot that we are studying currently. It's kind of convenient that we're actually right in the middle of the 5 Parshiot of the Torah that discuss the construction of the tabernacle. And as we saw, that's the basic commandment to build the temple. And it's good also, we have a leap year this year, which means we'll have time to study Wayakel and Pikudei, which on the surface seem to just be a reiteration of most of what we saw these past 2 weeks. We have actually much more time to go over them, at least if you're doing the annual cycle. The question was regarding idolatry. In the olden days, and even today, people used to believe that this imagined God, this entity that is not the one true God, has the power to harm or the power to protect. And people used to live in fear of these things. As a matter of fact, that's also what sometimes something's fear, or the fear of something, is considered a god. Like Jacob swore by Pachad Aviv Yitzchak, that which his father Isaac dreaded. It's a reference to Isaac's tremendous fear of heaven. But sometimes it's used in, I guess, in what Chazal say, Gnai. It's not used in a good way. It's referring to the idols that the heathens used to fear. And you see, for example, in the Targum a lot of times, an idol is referred to as something from the Shoresh Dahala, Dalet Chet Lamed, which is the Shoresh for fear, the root for fear in Aramaic. Dachlil is modern Hebrew for a scarecrow, and Bidchilu means in fear. And there's some Kabbalistic prayers that use that word a lot. Bidchimu or V'chimu. V'chimu is Ahava in Aramaic. So they used to fear these things. An imagined entity could cause harm to them. And nowadays, people behave that way with regards to things that are also imaginary. We know that they actually have no purpose. He was talking specifically of the face masks. Now, 2 years ago, when the whole China virus thing started, people were afraid, and they took precautions. And we should have known, as people are now increasingly knowing, that perhaps there are certain precautions that are really not that helpful, the masking especially. But what are we going to do? There was a suffix 2 years ago. It was a good idea to perhaps take precautions, but many of us were not foreign tourists who did this to prevent themselves from, let's say, coughing and sneezing. Remember, 5 years ago, you saw someone with a mask. It meant they were either an oral surgeon or a tourist from the Far East, where they had proper manners, so if they didn't feel good, and they wouldn't be coughing all over the place. That's what the masks were originally meant for, to prevent the dentist from spitting into people's mouths if he's talking to his assistant, or from getting, I don't know what. He uses machinery that causes things to spray a little bit. So, of course, he wants to protect himself, but it was not meant as an air filter. So nowadays you see people who, for some irrational reason, are fearful. The powers that be have instilled this incredible fear in them in order to maintain their own power. And now they cling to these things, or they have these things cling to their faces as though it's going to protect them. But a rational person knows that it does nothing. Is that idolatrous? And the answer is, in this particular case, there is a hint of idolatrous thinking, but it's also just superstitious. That is, yes, when a person has beliefs that are completely irrational about harm that could come to him or how things protect him, he is being foolish, and that could lead to idolatry, but no one's actually worshiping the mask. The mask is not, no one's offering sacrifice to it, no one's praying to it, no one's hugging it, no one's kissing it. Maimonides, for example, explains to us what is and what is not idolatry. And one of the important things he says is that to perform an act of idolatry, one has to, let's say, perform one of the services that was performed in the temple. For example, sacrifice. And he also mentions, let's say, prayer and gipuf and nishuk, is hugging the idol, or bowing down to it or praying toward it. So those things are not done with these masks. Yes, people are being irrational, but it's not like it's idolatrously irrational. It's like any other superstition, which, by the way, could be a gateway drug to irrationality. Hold on one second. We have a question coming in. I'm going to say yes to this. And there we go. So that's the first question. We dealt with that privately. We'll now continue. I was trying to find a place, and I was looking through my Friedlander translation of the Mor Nevuchim, an element of the nature of sacrifices I wanted to share. Perhaps someone could enlighten me. If I'm mistaken, they should tell me, and if they know the source, they should tell me this. I couldn't find it just now. And Maimonides happens to mention that the way sacrifices were imagined in the olden days among once again, the old heathens, that the sacrifice is what appease the gods, and that's how you get the crops to grow, you could get the rains to fall, protect them from natural disaster. And not giving the gods their sacrifices could lead to disaster. The gods would get vengeful. But nowhere in our Torah does it say a thing like that with our God. Our God wants to limit sacrifice, and you could see in Mor Nevuchim, we've discussed these previously, the Rav discussed this also. What is the nature of sacrifice and what God wants from us? Nowhere do you find that God tells us that we're going to get the terrible tochacha, for example, if we neglect the sacrifices. Yes, we're going to neglect keeping the Torah, chesed and mishpat, etc., studying the Torah, living the Torah lives. But it doesn't say if you neglect the sacrifices, bad things will happen, or conversely, offering the sacrifices in their time is what will reward us with our sustenance. On the contrary, it's about keeping the Torah. We read in the Shema, you're supposed to keep the Torah, not worship idols. That's what's going to result in chas v'shalom, drought, famine, and exile. But it's not that the sacrifices and conducting the service is what protects us. Yes, we're supposed to bring sacrifice and we're supposed to have a temple, but you're not going to find it that the result will be prosperity. It's just a reach nicholach. Reach nicholach means, as we're told by the sages, and as you can find in the Targum, and as Rambam emphasizes, reach nicholach means God accepts with favor that which we have done. We have done His will, and He is happy, and we have not gone against His will. I have brought a section here of the halachot from Yesodei Torah, the first section of the Mishnah Torah, where Rambam describes some basics of creation and also basic commandments, what it means to have a God and to fear God and to love God. And at the beginning of the fifth parak, he mentions that there's two specific commandments, one positive, one negative. One is for the Jewish people, every single Jewish person, to sanctify God's name. And conversely, the negative commandment is not to desecrate God's name. And as we saw a few years ago, this commandment does not apply to Gentiles. What's the nafka mina? What's the practical application of this commandment? Well, at the end of this chapter, he's going to say a person should live a life of Torah, be a role model, and be a tzaddik, and wear his talis and tefillin all day, and be honest, and deal honestly with everybody, and do acts of chesed, and that would be a sanctification of God's name. But the more unfortunate applicable circumstance is when forced to violate the Torah. A Gentile has no such commandments, and therefore, Rambam says, Gentiles are not to give up their lives if they're given a choice of violating one of their commandments or death. Whereas a Jew actually has to make certain calculations. If it's a so-called minor transgression, then he should just transgress if he's forced into it. And also, by the way, it doesn't matter if being forced into, but let's say a Gentile oppressor or by sickness. If just the circumstances that God has brought this person into are making him have to violate one of the commandments, then he should do so in order to live. So you've heard terrible stories in Jews being forced to violate some sort of commandment or on the pain of death, so they are supposed to violate the commandment, or someone is in a situation, life-threatening danger on the Sabbath, so he's supposed to violate the Sabbath and not die. But there are exceptions to this rule. And the Gentile has no such considerations whatsoever. The Gentile just violates, even if they told him to do one of the big three. And the big three, of course, are bloodshed, idolatry, and the Gilui Ariyot, the forbidden relations. A Jew forced into one of these circumstances, either once again by the oppressor or by circumstances. The Gemara gives an example. He's going to die of love sickness if he cannot be with this woman. So Chazal said, okay, so let him die. He's going to kill himself with his longing. So it's better that way than to have immorality and for the daughters of Israel to be treated in such a disgusting manner. In this halacha, the Rambam brings something that is relevant to today, and that is he talks about Shat Hashmad. Shat Hashmad is a time of persecution, extreme persecution. Now, Shmad is an interesting word here. Why? Hold on one second. Okay, so we just got an answer to another question. That's I think the Rav will go share on that. What's the bracha on learning Torah? But first, Shmad. This doesn't mean, let's say, genocide. Unfortunately, in we've seen throughout history, there's always some sort of oppressor who wants to, like we say in the Agadah, to destroy everybody, and God protects us from them, Haman, etc. Shmad in this case means destroying the religion. Think about the Hadrianic persecutions, and a Mishumad, which would be someone who they are Mishamed, is a renegade Jew, someone who is taken off the derech, forced into worshiping idols, for example. So this doesn't mean physical destruction. This means destruction of Torah and the Torah way of life. During a time of Shmad, and he gives an example, when a king, a wicked king like Nebuchadnezzar or the like, it doesn't mean his friends, it means people like him. V'igzor shmadal Yisrael v'atel datam o mitzvah min mitzvot. He decrees a shmad against Israel to annul their religion or one of their commandments, any commandment, whether positive or negative, by the way. So that's what Nebuchadnezzar wanted to do. Why did he bring this example? Because Nebuchadnezzar did not intend to destroy the Jewish people. That was never his intention. Even the Bible, he's depicted as someone thoroughly wicked, and the sages and the Gemara even say that he went to Gehenna. He didn't even fit there. That was too much for him. This wicked Nebuchadnezzar, who oversaw the destruction of the first temple and the exile of her people to Babylonia, did not want to destroy the Jewish religion. He originally conquered Jerusalem, and he took away our king and the cream of the Jewish people, because he knew it was to his benefit to have these Jews. He specifically, as described in the book of Daniel, took their finest in order to be his servants. And there's a reason why he took away the Harashim Asgar, which Chazal described as the most learned of our people. Rabbi Victor Miller said Nebuchadnezzar understood that the land of Judah was known for producing men of wisdom and virtue, or wise and virtuous men. And that's what Nebuchadnezzar wanted. That's what he took out of the land of Judah, and it was for good reason. And he only ended up destroying the temple and exiling the rest of the people. I'm not saying he was justified in doing this. I'm saying his plan was not to do so, but he did so because they rebelled against him. But he still, even when he could, he took them into exile. He did not mass murder them. Yes, there were people who were killed in battle, and there are quite too many, but still, it was not his intention to destroy them. Instead, it's talking about he was trying to destroy their religion. When was he trying to destroy their religion? And we have to see, well, hold on one second. He did build a great idol and force everybody to bow down to them. And it's when Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah refused to bow down to that idol, as described in the early chapters of Daniel. No, but that was something he was forcing on everybody, and that was idolatry. Here, Rambam's talking about getting rid of their religion, or just any one of their commandments. So this is referring to a specific instance when Nebuchadnezzar thought to do this. Any particular mitzvah. So let's give an example today. Let's say they were trying to force people to say. By the way, we said he could have brought the example of Haman and Achashverosh, who would come up with the plan of genocide. That would have been more convenient, but not any of them. And he could have, let's say, in Antiochus or whatever, but those aren't necessarily in the Bible already. So this is the best example. He wanted to get rid of their religion or one of their commandments. So when did Nebuchadnezzar try to do such a thing? I was showing my daughter this earlier on Shabbos, that there might not have been a particular time when he did this, but it seems that that's what he wanted to do to individual Jews. That is, make them violate the commandments because he wanted to. He wanted to, for example, make one of the mitzvot like as though it does not exist anymore, or one of the negative commandments not exist. The Lamad Devar Domet today, for example, when you have forces within the land of Israel and outside the land of Israel who are, let's say, trying to imagine and get people to believe that the forbidden relations no longer exist. There's no such thing as Gilu Arayot. That which the Torah prohibits, like we saw a few weeks ago, is not. It just doesn't exist. And you even have people who call themselves rabbi who are trying to remove the stigma and the prohibition from things that are explicit in the Torah, both for Gentiles and for Jewish people alike. So when you have a situation like that, when the program is to annul a mitzvah or a category of mitzvahs called the chomer, whether it's a positive or negative commandment, so we're told to give our lives. The Jew should let himself be killed and not violate it. Even one of the other mitzvahs, not even the Gila Rayos mitzvahs. Whether it's being forced to among 10 other Jews who are watching a minyan or among the Gentiles. That is, this is a red line. When it comes to the evildoers trying to impose a sin on us, trying to make it that this sin is no longer a sin, so all bets are off. We'd rather die than do such a thing. And that's why, for example, I support and I understand why does the Rosh Yeshiva have asked people to, their B'nai HaYeshiva, the yeshiva students, to do something because they feel that the entire concept of Gilui Arayot is under threat, that they're trying to do something, remake society, a society that does not believe in these prohibitions, and that could only be to our detriment. And that will be enough for that. Back to building the Beit HaMikdash over here, there is a halacha that Rambam says, referring to the protrusions or the projections on the outer walls of the temple. And this is an interesting thing because we saw last week, I showed the pictures. This isn't how everybody understands it. According to the Rambam, the temple from the outside was mostly cubical. That is the edifice of the temple. It was 100 amot by 100 amot by 100 amot. But as we pointed out, because it had to be wider toward the front, whereas the other Mefarshim basically have the temple with which we are familiar from the classical models and other pictures made from there. The temple was T-shaped, wider toward the front, at 100 amma facade in the front, but the back part, the leg of the T, was basically only 70 ammas wide. Rambam has it 100 by 100 by 100, although it's some sort of trapezoidal shape. I don't know how it goes about doing that, but that's what they assume. And you can read the new commentaries that explain how it was. And 100 ammas tall the entire way. Also, that there were these protrusions on the outer walls. He says, it's in the outside. And these yatziyas are, what it says, projections. And in the Perishah Mishnayot, the Rambam says to prevent people from climbing the temple. How do they do that? Because the first one sticks out chamesh, that's 5 ammas out of the wall. Roved al gova shesh, and then a roved, this is basically a rampart, another layer sticking out of it that was 6 ammas projecting. So you understand if the person tried to get up the wall, so suddenly the next level protrudes from the wall another amma outward. Ve'atziyam sa'it shesh, another one that was another protrusion that was 6 ammas. Ve'roved al gova sheva, and another layer, which is basically open space, protruding 7. Sheva, another one 7 above it. So the temple basically got wider as you would try to climb it. And that's what it says here. We saw in the pictures before that they say, no, this means that the inner walls of the temple had certain protrusions, and it was within those inner walls such that the ta'im, the open spaces between the outside of the temple and the Kodesh and Kodesh Kodeshim, were actually filling up those spaces. And we saw a picture here. It said Chabad.org has as a favor to Klal Yisrael, they now have the images that were in the Steinsaltz commentary, which I'm going to put on the screen forthwith over here. Hold on one second to help us explain this. Here it is. We saw this last week. Like I said, I'm very much appreciative to see this picture. Nope, this is the next paragraph. By the way, this is a picture we tried to show. This is how the Rambam imagined the temple, by the way. See, it looks basically cubical, whereas everybody else imagines it like this. We just said that. So we're going to go back a page before we get to these halachot. What I just described is over here, the roved, which would be, where is it? Over there. So this is how he describes it in the Perush HaMishnayot. See, if a person were standing over here outside, you'd see that this is sticking out of the temple, 5 amas, and the next one is 6, and then another Yetziyah, and then sticking out 7, and it would basically be impossible to climb this. Why were people even trying to climb the temple? I do not know. Over here, this is how some people imagine what the Rambam's saying also in his Perush HaMishnayot, which is a little bit different. It means that these things both protrude a certain distance from the wall, and then there's open spaces here. And if it were like this, it would be very hard to climb also. I think this would actually be easier to climb. This is how the other Mefarshim have it, that there's a protrusion more toward the base over here in the wall. It has a certain width, and then the empty space where there was a ta gets bigger as you go up through the temple. Okay, there's all those empty spaces. What did they do with these spaces? I don't know. It doesn't really say when they were actually going in them. We saw that a person would, the Kohen specifically, would go through this door, this side door, in order to get to the ta, in order to go over here, to get into the Heichal, in order to open it from the inside in the morning. There was no door over here. And that there was an equal door over here that was always closed because the prophet said so. And we then saw that this is the Rambam's, I'll make it bigger so it fixes the screen. This is the way the Rambam imagines all these empty spaces. And it actually comes out that if you were looking at the temple from the front side, you'd see a big open area. The main gate was open. There's no actual doors to this thing going into the Ulam, but it must have been kind of drafty, because if you're standing behind the temple on the west side, you'd see openings, which is kind of strange. This would be an opening over here that'd have a certain width, basically 3 amas wide, and there'd be 10 amma opening over here, and it goes clear through to the temple, which means it was basically a hollow temple. It wasn't closed up. And this wall over here also freestanding. Also above the main floor of the temple, here we saw this, the Heichal, it's 40 amas tall. There's still another almost 54 amas to go in the height. And it seems that this aliyah, this main chamber above the temple, although it was also had kiur, we said kiur was decorative ceiling. What was it for? What were they doing up here? Mostly nothing. There was no service up there. It was just basically an empty room. It doesn't say anywhere that they used it for storage even. So we're going to stop this and get back to the text. Why do I bring this up? Because this open space was basically used over here. It says this is how they would send down craftsmen when they needed to do repairs in the temple, and specifically in the Kodesh Kodeshim. So they didn't even use this, by the way, for entering the Kodesh. If they needed to make repairs to the floor, etc., in the Kodesh, that's the main room of the Heichal, where the menorah and the shulchan was, apparently they just went in through one of these side doors, the same side door that the Kohen would do in the morning. But to get into the Kodesh Kodeshim, he couldn't go the way that the high priest would go when conducting the service in Yom Kippur. He had to go through this skylight, this roof, basically, in this elevator. And the idea of an elevator is actually quite old. Just modern technology makes it motorized, that you don't have to actually have a guy up there with the pulley and the ropes doing it, or by the chains. Instead, you have a machine doing it. That's the chiddush of a modern elevator, but that's what's described here. They would lower them down in tevot. Teva is basically a big box, basically an elevator. So they would lower him down in this elevator, and so that he would only see what he needs to see, and that's how they do it. Over here, Rambam concludes this parak with something that I was looking up. It's unclear what he means by melabnin et haichal. They would whiten the heichal. This is similar to the expression that we find in the Mishnah about how they would whiten the altar on a regular basis. How often? I think that's a dispute. We're going to see, but he paskins one way. The altar had blood applied to it all the time. And at different parts of it, some blood is applied to the horns, some blood is applied to the corners, the base, depending on the certain sacrifices above the chuta sikra, above that halfway point of the altar, sometimes below. But the blood did not stay there. The altar itself, we saw, was made out of whole stones, but it was filled in, and it was plastered white on the outside. So you couldn't really tell what material was made out of if they did a really good plastering job. So they would occasionally whiten the altar. They would put a new layer of clean white plaster, especially for holidays. That makes sense because the altar was made out of white and was basically made out of stone and concrete. But the outside of the temple was made ideally out of gold. That's what the ideal was, or at least precious stones. The temple of Herod, for example, was eventually built of marble, very pretty stone. And it doesn't make sense that they would then cover it with plaster. So what does it mean? So it doesn't mean that they would apply new white plaster on the outside or the inside, because that's not what the walls were made of. It's not like, let's say, this base medrash, where the walls here that are showing are basically painted white and irregularly done so. That's a little bit too plain for the temple. So what does it mean? So perhaps it means they would clean the walls. They would, for example, you've seen classic buildings here in Jerusalem, when there is some certain type of runoff along the outer walls of the buildings, which, by the way, since the mandatory period, there has been a law on the books that buildings in Jerusalem have to at least have a Jerusalem stone facade. Why is that? Well, it used to be in the olden days, that's what they had. So the classic buildings in Jerusalem were built out of Jerusalem stone. But when construction really took off in the mandatory period, in preparation for the coming of the state, and of course nowadays, thank God, when we build high rises and basically skyscrapers in Jerusalem, they should build many more, and they should rebuild the temple also. Amen. Everything's made out of Jerusalem stone on the outside, but these older buildings, so they have runoff there, and sometimes they don't get enough sunlight, and you see it, there's black mold, etc., things forming on the Jerusalem stone. And what you need to do is you need to get in there and clean it. Sometimes they use sandblasting or a different type of water cannon or other things, bleach, whatever it is, they have to re-pretty the Jerusalem stone facade. So it is my suggestion that they would actually just clean the walls of the temple. They had to clean them, and that's what it means, malabadim. Just like, for example, with regards to wool, even if a sheep's wool is not necessarily white, a lot of sheep have, for example, black wool. With regards to the laws of Shabbos, we learned that you're not supposed to launder things on the Sabbath. Why? Because they would malabain, they would whiten, literally whiten the sheep's wool, but that means they would launder the wool. Doesn't mean that they were doing anything to necessarily whiten or lighten the wool. It just meant cleaning the wool. But that sometimes that's what this verb means. It means to clean something. So it doesn't mean whitening. It doesn't necessarily mean putting plaster on stone, whether it be other types of marble, etc., that was used in the construction of the Heichal. That's not what it means. Starting the fifth paragraph. Here we have the dimensions of Har Habai. Now, if you look at Har Habai, it doesn't fit what's described here, and that's attributable to the fact that Har Habai has been greatly expanded. It says Har Habai, Hu Har Moriah, the Temple Mount, which is Mount Moriah, Hayal Chamesh Meot Ama Al Chamesh Meot Ama. Use the past tense, by the way. Was 500 by 500 amas. Vaya Mukaf Koma. This situation is definitely not the one with which we are familiar with today, and not the one with which Maimonides was familiar in his own day. The Temple Mount hasn't been expanded since then. The Temple Mount is now surrounded by a wall, but it's a lot larger than 500 by 500 amas, and it's also not a square. It's obviously rectangular, but not a perfect rectangular. We had a map over here. I restarted the computer, so I lost it. I'll try to put it on the screen in a second. That basically shows the Temple Mount as it exists today. You'll forgive me because these things here. Well, I guess we'll just use Rabbi Google over here to find this. Hold on one second. So the Temple Mount has been greatly expanded beyond these 500 by 500 meters, 500 amas. And it's only increased. Mostly the south side, as they say, has been added to. So let's look at this picture over here for a second. I'm going to open this one up, and you'll have it. I like this one because it's available for free on Wikipedia, but also because it's used by Makbili and others to show us where we are allowed to walk, even up to today on the Temple Mount. We've used this one before. So this is a classic picture which shows where, to the best of our understanding, the temple stood in the olden days. Now, how did they decide where to put the image of the temple over it? So here you see the T-shaped temple, and this is the inner courtyard, and this is the outer courtyard. How do they know to do that? Well, they center the area of the Holy of Holies right where the Dome of the Rock is, where the rock is supposed to be. That's the first thing. And then they know this orientation. Notice it doesn't fit perfectly, let's say, east to west, as we would like it on our map. They know that the area that defined the place, the Nicanor Gate, the ascension, the steps between what's called the women's courtyard, the outer courtyard, and the inner courtyard was along this line. Why? Because that's the natural topography, and that's where the steps still exist unto today. And it fits the dimensions. So they know that what was the women's courtyard is now this area over here, and the official courtyard began over here. These structures are still here today. They just built over it. And by the way, this is the place where they pray on a regular basis. And there are people who basically can walk up until right where I'm pointing the cursor over here. And I remember one time my daughter tried to run even past here. And it shows you that the kids have their values set a lot better than the adults do. So the Temple Mount basically has expanded mostly in this direction. This would be the south side. This is what's known as the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which, as they classically point out, this whole area wasn't classically Temple Mount. This is all new. And the Temple Mount has also been expanded on this north side. There's not much to expand on the east side. This is basically almost a cliff. This is the outer wall of the old city of Jerusalem. And this retaining wall over here is the western wall. That's the way it was in the olden days. And this is the Kotel Plaza, the unfortunate place that's basically taken the place of the temple in the eyes of our political class and a lot of the religious establishment and the people who observe Judaism as a folk religion. This is the replacement for the temple area. So these things exist. This allows us to locate where the halachic Temple Mount, this 500 by 500 amot, are supposed to be. And this, they say, is the Chel, basically the place where we're going to see a little bit later where they had other limits to go. So you see the Temple Mount has been greatly expanded beyond the 500 amas by 500 amas as described by Maimonides here. Where do we get this number? Well, it says, it's an explicit verse in Ezekiel. It says here, "V'kipin al gabe kipin hayu b'niyot mitachtav mipnei oil atuma." The Temple Mount was basically hollowed out. It was kipin, which is archways, but an archway is only in 2 dimensions, and it's kind of narrow. If you build an arch in 3 dimensions, you have a dome. And indeed, if you've been in these areas over here, if you look at the old city, you realize the old city of Jerusalem, what's the ground floor is not the ground floor. It's just been built over other structures that were previously there. I recommend everybody go see what's underneath Yeshivat HaKotel. Yeshivat HaKotel stands above what's known as the Herodian Quarter. They just put down these gigantic pillars and built over it. And the so-called Kotel tunnels are nothing of the sort. They are not tunnels. They are basically the older structures that existed underneath what they, for some reason, call the Arab Quarter. I do not know why. I mean, I do know why they called it that, but I don't agree with why they call it that. That's just the original structures down there, and they've built over them. They were not tunnels. And you could go to many of the tunnels also that run the length of the Western Wall, so-called tunnel. It's only a tunnel because it's underneath a lot of things nowadays, but no one ever tunneled it. It was there originally. So, and you see what's holding up, what's above you when you're in these so-called tunnels. It's basically domes, many arched domes, which are, are perfectly structurally stable. So you could just build right over them as though it's the ground. So that's what the Temple Mount is. This is the Temple Mount of the Second Temple period already. It's basically one gigantic hollowed structure. I remember being in Manhattan, large parts of Manhattan, you think you're on the ground floor, but you're really not. There's all sorts of subway tunnels going underneath you. They hollowed the whole thing out. And I remember also being at YU's campus. There was a place, at least then, between 2 buildings. It was called the Florence Tenzer Gardens. And it was right ground level with Amsterdam Avenue. But then you realize, you're just on the roof of a building. You looked on the far side over it. You're basically looking off. You're on the 7th floor of a building. that was made to have a roof that's flush with Amsterdam Avenue. And then you walk south on Amsterdam Avenue and you realize, wait a minute, they're highways. I-95 east and west run underneath a lot of those apartment buildings and everything there. It's basically been hollowed out. So that's what the Temple Mount was. The Temple Mount was hollowed out in order that if there was some sort of tumah, a dead body really underneath the ground there, the tumah would get stopped by the kippah, because the tumah stops where there's a roof. Once there's a certain amount of area between where the tumah lies and there's a ceiling above it, so that basically stops the tumah there. If you bury a person directly in the ground without this hefsek, then the impurity of that dead person would just go straight up to the top of the grave. So that someone standing over the grave or kal v'chomer directly on the grave would get that tumah. But in this case, the Temple Mount is entirely hollowed out. That explains why they're able to, according to the sages, the Ark of the Covenant, by the way, is hidden right here. So this would be, we're going to see soon, the Dir Eitzim is a southeast corner of the women's courtyard. So basically when we pray, we're praying near this hidden area. And they know about all these, what the chambers and walkways that are underneath the Temple Mount. Of course, they should have the Jewish people have access to this so that they can, get going on constructing the temple. But for now, we're going to leave it at that. Now, how do we know that the Temple Mount is supposed to have a 500 by 500 area? Well, it says it here in the book of Yechezkel, where he's describing what the temple is supposed to be in the future. He says, in the four directions he measured it. There was a wall around it, all around. It was 500 amas long and 500 amas wide to differentiate between the Kodesh and the Chol. In this case, between the Holy Temple Mount area and the rest, which is relative to it, is Chol, is secular, although it's still Jerusalem. Rabbi Tauger doesn't say this. I saw in his commentary, but he brings somewhere interesting. He says that there are those who say, and I don't know who it was, that's based on this Yerushalmi, which defines certain areas, the Karpif and all that. And you see a Karpif has 500 square amos here. What is he talking about? Vod Amar Rav Yehuda ben Bava, Haginav HaKarpishu Shivim Amma v'Shirayim al Shivim Amma v'Shirayim, Mukevek Ader Gavoa Yutfachim Metaltlim B'Tocha Uvad Sheiba Shomira Obeit Diro Shteis Muchalair. He's saying here you have a karpif. This is an area outside the city or a garden. A karpif is just an open area with trees and etc. He says if it's a square, 70 amma, a little bit more than 70 ammas by 70 ammas, a little bit more than that. That's what Shirayim means. And it's surrounded by a fence that's at least 10 tefachs high. So it is now a private domain, and a person could carry in there on the Sabbath, metaltim b'tucha, on the Sabbath. And as long as, on one condition, there has to be like a guardhouse, that's a shomerah, or some other residence within that thing, or it has to be adjacent to the city. If it's not, then this, even though it has these dimensions and this wall or this fence around it, as we says, gader is a fence. Sometimes gader means a wall. It's a private. It's a public domain, or at least it's a Carmelite, so a person would not be able to carry around there. So you do simple math. 70, a little bit more than 70 ammas times a little bit more than 70 ammas gives you a little bit more than 4,900 square ammas, and that's where you get 5,000 square ammas. So this still doesn't tell us here, because here we have 500 by 500 should be 25 with 4 zeros after it, so 250,000 square ammas. If I did the math right, let's see, it's 25 with 4 zeros. Yeah, that's 250,000. So he says that there's this idea over here, continuing in the Yerushalmi, that they learned this from the Chatzer of the Mishkan, which is 50 ammas by 100 ammas. So 50 by 100, that's much less than 500 by 500. 50 by 100 only gives you 5,000 square ammas. So 5,000 square ammas is a Chatzer, and that's what a karpif matches up with. So then they say that, yeah, but the pasuk is a little bit strange, because rochav chamishim b'chamishim, the width itself is 50 by 50. Now, we know in Pshat, you can go look in the Mefarshim, they say it's 100 ammas was the length of the courtyard of the tabernacle, and the width was 50. It should say rochav chamishim. What's chamishim b'chamishim? 50 by 50. It's making one of the dimensions already squared. So it seems that they're describing, if I told you there was an area and then I told you, I gave you 3 dimensions, 100 by 50 by 50. It sounds more like a volume, and that 50 must be the height, but that's not what it means. So they say that no, it's an allusion to eventually the courtyard of the temple or the tabernacle would be 50 by 50 by 100, which comes out to the 250,000 we mentioned earlier. If you calculate the Temple Mount today, which is equivalent to 500 by 500. Yeah, so I don't know where they get this. I have to find the sources, but that's what he says. And I don't see why they're describing the entire Temple Mount. Just because it sounds fantastic almost, that because the tabernacle was described as having a courtyard of 100 by 50. So yeah, that's the tabernacle courtyard. That's the way it was in the Mishkan also, in Shiloh apparently. And the extra 50 means that eventually the courtyard will be 50 times as big as it originally was, for a measurement of 250,000 square amos. But in this case, we're talking about the courtyard. What I just described over here, the 500 by 500, is the entire Temple Mount, including all the courtyards. So it's a little bit difficult. So we'll leave that with a little difficulty. This is the continuing of the Yerushalmi, how they say, well, it's not, to get this 5,000, you actually have to have sides of 70 and 2/3 amos, basically. They continue rounding it. Chazal didn't use the type of math we use now. A lot of is rounding, and we've seen this before, how they assume that, let's say, the square root of 2 is basically 1.4. They say 1 and 2/5. It's a good enough approximation for our purposes, for learning Sukkot and Eruvin, but we know that it's not perfect, or that the fact that a lot of times, even worse, they use pi instead of pi, they use 3. I don't think that they were using it so literally, but they're using it as estimation. How do I know they weren't using 3, 4 pi? Because you see that when it came to trying to find, let's say, the square root of 2, they were more exact. They didn't just say 1.5. They said 1 2/5, which is significantly closer than saying pi is 3. Next, the 5 gates. It says Chamisha Sharim Hayulo, to the Temple Mount. Right, hold on. Yeah, this is the next halacha. Echad min hamarav, one on the west, that's behind the temple. Ve'echad min hamizrach, one on the east. Ve'echad min hatzafon, one on the north. Ushnayim min hadarom, 2 on the south. Roklav kol shar eser amoth. Ve'gova esrim ve'yesh lahem delatot. So every shar had the same dimensions. It's going to have a width of 10 amas, which we said is about 15 feet wide. Govho esrim, 20 amas tall. Which means that it would be about 30 feet high, and yesh lahem delatot, and they also had doors. That's significant. Sometimes you could just make a gateway without any doors, and you've probably seen the current gates of Jerusalem, of the old city, are built in the old style, and sometimes they do have doors, and they used to be able to close those doors at night. But nowadays, right next to the Jaffa Gate, for instance, they've breached the gate. That's from the Kaiser's visit way back when. Must have been in the early 1900s, I think, and since then they haven't closed it back up. They just removed a huge section of wall, so it's just open there, and it'll never be closed unless they rebuild the wall. But nowadays, there's a main street that goes right through that gigantic breach in the wall, and most people don't realize that they look at Jaffa Gate. They're saying, well, this looks like a gate. Yes, it has. You have to turn 90 degrees to get into the gate, but just beyond the gate, there's just a gigantic hole in the wall. What's going on there? That wasn't intentional. We'll leave this for tonight with one thing that the Rambam happens to mention about exaggerated numbers. He says Og Melech HaBashan was basically 6 amos tall. That's how he gives it. And he says that it's not an exaggeration. Yes, there's a lot of midrashim that exaggerate these things, but that number is you can reach it because it says that he had a bed. His eres was 9 amot ba'amot ish, regular amot, which we say is about 48 centimeters, a foot and a half. And the Rambam says a regular person's bed is gives 2/3 is for the person's height plus another third just there. So if a person has a bed 9 amot long, it means the person is 6 amot himself. So you would make this og basically 9 feet tall. He says that's not so fantastic. There are some people who are freakishly tall, and that's the whole point. That og was like that. Nowadays, the tallest athletes we have who are healthy are basically 7 feet tall, and there's always someone who's a little bit taller than that. So this og apparently was from a race of people who genetically had who were taller, the Anakim, the Riphaim, the Zamzumim, given a number of names there in Dvarim. So they had a natural tallness, and Og was exceptional among them. And that's why they put his bed on display in Rabat Bnei Ammon to show how great a victory the Ammonites had against Og's people before, of course, Og and Sichon came back and retook that land for the Ammonites and Moabites. And that we'll discuss when the Parsha happens. So that's the dimensions that they have for all these 5 gates. These gates don't exist anymore today, by the way. Since then, the walls of the current Temple Mount, some are ancient, but the walls and the gates around the Temple Mount are relatively new. The retaining walls around the Temple Mount, for example, are ancient. They're from Second Temple times, but the gates going onto the Temple Mount are not. So you're not going to find exactly as described here, especially because where the southern gates were, there's now open space, and the Al-Aqsa Mosque takes up the space where there's supposed to be a new southern gate. So that's a little bit that has to be adjusted. Perhaps I don't think it's critical, by the way. The Ram doesn't say that this is Ma'akev. It's not necessarily described in the book of Yechezkel either that this is the way it's supposed to be. So perhaps the situation can remain. Although something should change with the gates, and that is nowadays Jewish people are only allowed to enter what's called the Muharabi gate, and they're made to exit. I think it's called the chain gate, if I'm not mistaken. And the other gates are open to the people who wish to destroy them. And it is my fervent wish that that situation change speedily, and that the Jewish people will be given proper control, that the Levites be given the control over who gets to enter the Temple Mount complex and when, and that they allow the Jewish people to go in there also. So we'll take questions or comments. No, this next question also is irrelevant to this. So if that's all, we're going to call it a night and call it a week, or at least wish you a good week. Anything? No, I'm checking here. Nothing on the WhatsApp. Okay, so have a good night and see you next time. Be well.
We would like to encourage our viewers to share these videos with friends and send in your responses. We would also like to suggest the following opportunity to our viewers. If you identify with Rabbi Bar-Hayim's message and would like to sponsor or dedicate a video interview with the rabbi in honor or memory of a loved one, if you would like to obtain Birkon Nusach Eretz Yisrael or invite the rabbi for a speaking engagement, please email us at office@machonshilo.org. If you are inspired by Rabbi Bar-Hayim's message and would like to get involved in Torah Eretz Yisrael activities in your local area, please fill out the relevant form by going to the link which appears on the screen.